Good morning, Virtual Oakland. My name is Shaanan Cohney, and I'm going to be talking to you today about some attacks on counter-DRBG that my co-authors and I discovered. In recent times, we've seen plenty of attacks against pseudo-random number generators, which form a critical part of any crypto system. As many have demonstrated, when an RNG is compromised, it can result in devastating attacks against the system of which it is a part. To refresh your memory of some of these attacks, first up, and of greatest infamy, the dual EC backdoor and its ramifications for the security of Juniper's ScreenOS, on which my co-authors and I presented at CCS 2016. Then, last year, we presented the duck attack on ANSI X931, another example showing how state compromise leads to fatal protocol flaws. Many of these designs are standardized in a set of publications under the SP890 moniker. These publications list designs approved by NIST, the US National Institute of Standards and Technology. Among them are dual EC, which was deprecated following NIST's internal investigation, HMAC DRBG, hash DRBG, and the focus of today's talk, counter DRBG. Up until recently, there was limited formal analysis of these designs, with the concurrent work of Woodage and Shumo presented last year providing some much-needed analysis to fill the gap. Counter-DRBG, the focus of today's talk, is a pseudo-random number generator designed around a block cipher running in counter mode. To give a sense of how widely the design is used, we counted how many different products had FIPS documentation specifying use of the design. These documents, part of a NIST certification program, provide assurance that a product or module meets the dictates of FIPS, the Federal Information Processing Standards. We found that over 67% of certified implementations use counter-DRBG. Such products included major cryptographic libraries, operating systems, and even CPUs, which embedded the design into hardware. Counter-DRBG's design includes state, which is composed of a key K and a counter V. The broad mechanic of the design revolves around incrementing the counter, which the algorithm then encrypts with the block cipher, taking the ciphertext as the output of the RNG. The standard includes an option for the user or the implementer of the RNG to provide additional entropy, which is encrypted along with the counter in order to provide protection against state compromise. Some of the details. Output generation can be conceptualized as a three-stage process. In the first and third stages, the generator increments the counter and encrypts it, along with any additional entropy the implementer has chosen to include. This is done under the key K. The resulting ciphertext is split into a new key and a new counter value. The next phase is very similar. The generator increments and encrypts the counter. Only this time, no additional entropy is included. The ciphertext becomes the output from the RNG. This phase is repeated until the generator has produced enough random bytes to satisfy a user's request. The third stage is identical to the first and serves to update the RNG's state. This design looks not so bad at first, but Woodage and Shumo noticed a subtle flaw. Problem number 1. The key is not rotated until after the encryptions are done. The loop in the output generation phase does not include key rotation, potentially allowing a large number of encryptions to occur under the same key. Therefore, if an attacker compromises the key at any point during the phase, she might be able to recover the RNG's internal state. Problem number 2. The standard allows the implementer to choose whether or not to include additional entropy, and further does not specify how much additional entropy is wise to include, allowing any implementer to ignore it altogether. Let's focus in on these problems. Again, problem 1, if the attacker compromises the key using something like, say, a side-channel attack, the attacker can recover the counter. The attacker does so by decrypting an output from the RNG and incrementing the plaintext appropriately to match the number of blocks that were generated for the user's corresponding request for random bytes. This has the effect of enabling the attacker to compute all other RNG outputs generated in the phase, as well as the state of the generator at the beginning and end of the phase. The second problem concerns the lack of entropy, without which the generator cannot recover from state compromise. An attacker who compromises the state of the RNG, as described previously, must guess the value of add-in, so as to compute the subsequent state of the RNG. If add-in contains insufficient entropy, and the attacker is able to guess it, she can compute the subsequent outputs of the RNG. Note that to do this, an attacker must guess add-in twice. Once for phase 3 of the current call, and once for phase 1 of the subsequent call. If no additional entropy is used, this process is trivial. Simply increment the counter and run it through the block cipher. The important question for our work was the following: is such an attack realizable in practice? There are a couple of preconditions necessary for this to be the case. First, an implementation must be vulnerable to state compromise, most likely through a side-channel attack on the key. AES, the block cipher used in most counter-DRBG implementations, is well known to possess side-channel vulnerabilities if implemented in software with lookup tables for its various internal operations. But we've known about this for a very long time, so one might expect all implementations to use AES-NI or other hardware-based AES by default. Well, yes, most implementations use hardware AES when a user requests the encryption of a string, but surprisingly, it turns out a number revert to software-based AES when used as part of counter-DRBG. Of the implementations that we surveyed, it's notable that OpenSSL was not vulnerable, except when used in FIPS mode. Ironically, OpenSSL in FIPS mode contains weaknesses that the regular version does not. This is admittedly an old version of OpenSSL that was deprecated at the end of last year, but serves to illustrate that elements of a flawed standard can reduce security while the standard purports to improve it. FIPS, the US federal security standard, is no magic bullet. This is not entirely surprising, given the way that FIPS discusses side-channel vulnerabilities. FIPS 140, which up until September was the most recent version, permits the certification of modules with known side-channel vulnerabilities. To quote the standard, cryptographic modules may be susceptible to other attacks, e.g. power analysis timing attacks, and/or fault induction. It also goes on to note that requirements for mitigating these flaws are not available, and are otherwise outside the scope of the standard. Therefore, it's unsurprising that SP 890, which is part of FIPS, doesn't include side channels within its threat model. The second precondition for mounting a successful attack against counter-DRBG is discovering a scenario wherein our attacker can actually observe raw output from the RNG. In such a scenario, the generator must also produce enough output during its phase 2 loop to make a side-channel attack viable. We therefore needed to determine if this can occur in a real-world protocol like TLS. Ideally, the attacker would use side-channel analysis to extract the key during protocol execution, and then decrypt a block of observed output to obtain the counter value. Unlike the Juniper and Duck attacks on RNGs mentioned earlier, which required only a few blocks of observed output, our attack requires that the generator produce a significant number of blocks, of which only one of them needs to be observed. The Juniper and Duck attacks use the short nonces and server random values exposed during a TLS handshake to compromise the RNG. The client and server randoms produced during a TLS handshake are only a block or two, but we need a full 2,000 bytes in order to perform our attack, quite a lot more. So, we exhaustively went through the entire TLS spec looking for places where the output of the random number generator is used, and checked if we could get the protocol into a state where we could observe at least some of this output. First thing we looked at was RSA-PSS, an encryption scheme with randomized padding supported in TLS 1.2. No luck. RFC 8446 restricts the amount of randomized padding that can be used as part of a TLS 1.2 key exchange. What about extended random? This was a proposed TLS extension that allowed a user to request arbitrary amounts of RNG output. This was great for the Juniper attack, but unfortunately there were no implementations around for us to test. It's also non-standard, which makes it less interesting. Last but not least, PKCS number 1 v1.5 padding. Well, this is a familiar bugbear and perhaps the solution to our problems. It turns out if the server uses a really large RSA modulus, the client will generate a correspondingly large amount of randomized padding, which the server then gets to observe. So, if you get a malicious website to serve a really large certificate, once a client encrypts the TLS pre-master secret to their certificate and sends it over, the server can decrypt the message and see the randomized padding. Let's develop this into a complete attack scenario. First, you need an attacker able to pull off the side channel attack. As is typical, we will assume the attacker is able to co-locate with their victim. One interesting twist that I'd point out here is that a lot of prior work of this type targets TLS servers, while our attack is different in that we target TLS clients, where the co-location assumption is actually less realistic. The client must subsequently connect to the attacker's malicious TLS server, which will serve a 16K RSA modulus. This server requests that the client use an RSA cipher suite, and further requires that the client authenticate itself according to the TLS spec. Last, when the client does authenticate itself, it must do so by way of an ECDSA signature. This is really quite a list of requirements that we're putting on our attacker, but the key point here is that by instantiating a theoretical weakness, we learn important lessons about the way we design and model RNGs. These lessons are actually quite useful, despite the fact that our attack scenario might seem a bit far-fetched. As is mandatory in any protocol talk, this is what the flow looks like. And I won't tire you by going through all the details other than to indicate two key features of the flow. Take a look at the client key exchange, where all the magic happens. There, the client connecting to the server sees that it needs to encrypt to a really large modulus, and therefore it generates a large amount of padding, 1,996 bytes, which the attacker will use as its opportunity to side-channel the RNG key. The very next thing that's generated by the RNG is the nonce used for ECDSA signing. If the ECDSA nonce is leaked, one can trivially combine it with a signature to compute the corresponding private key. This is exactly what we're going to do. What did this process look like in practice? We used flush reload to attack the software AES implementations used across the various libraries. We brute forced any additional entropy used by the implementations. And then, from the ECDSA signature and nonce, we computed the victim's ECDSA long-term private signing key. With the key in hand, our attacker can generate fraudulent signatures, thereby successfully impersonating the client. Tested our attack against 3 different implementations, and the different choices that each implementation made for including additional entropy changed the running time of the attack. The time complexity of the attack was totally reasonable, with the various implementations choices for additional entropy. While the bit width of the add-in variable may have been large in some instances, giving us a theoretically intractable amount of work, in practice many of the bits were predictable, leading to shorter actual recovery times. At a maximum, our brute force procedure took 30 minutes, and for Fortios, a prominent network operating system, we didn't have to do any work at all. No additional entropy was used in their implementation. We also discovered a bonus attack against TLS clients implemented with counter-DRBG that operate inside secure enclaves such as SGX. In these environments, it is often possible for a malicious OS to obtain high-resolution cache traces in the time domain by single-stepping the victim in the enclave. These high-resolution traces contain the state of the cache, not just before and after encryptions, but before and after individual rounds of the AES encryption process. This allows us to use a technique very similar to fault-based differential cryptanalysis, which relies on minimal differences between plaintexts to recover the key. We note that consecutive counter-DRBG plaintexts only differ in the last byte as it's a counter that's just being incremented. We are therefore able to obtain a differential path that we can use to recover the encryption key with only 2 encryptions. Unlike our earlier attack, in this scenario, the attacker does not need to observe any RNG outputs. Rather, she can extract all the information from the cache traces. However, there aren't many SGX TLS implementations in the wild, so this attack is also of lesser practical significance. What are our overall takeaways from this piece of work? Well, random number generators can be side-channeled too. It's not just encryption and signing that we need to worry about. We don't always learn the lessons we think we've learned. We should never use T-table AES anywhere, ever. This lesson is repeated time and time again, but it still appears not to have sunk in. Implementers and designers need to ensure that sufficient entropy is always incorporated. This too has led to innumerable RNG disasters in recent years. Counter-DRBG is not provably secure, and therefore implementers must take this into account if they plan on using it in a crypto system. FIPS 140-3 does update the threat model to incorporate side channels, but we should be sure when creating standards and designs in the future that we consider a variety of potential threats and not limit ourselves to what theoretical models may capture at the current time. Finally, when choosing what random number generator to use, if you are going to choose something from SV890, use #DRBG. It turns out that HMAC-DRBG also has some similarly subtle problems. Thanks very much for tuning in, and I hope to see all of you in person soon.